Hello and welcome to Foreign Dispatches. I'm Teniola Shoboale. On the program this week, the race for the White House comes to an end as Americans cast their votes. Plus, it's beginning to look a lot like Christmas in Europe, but COVID-19 lockdown dampens festivities. The night unfolded as the most unorthodox U.S. election night in modern memory. At times, it appeared like one candidate or the other was heading for an early win in important states. But batches of mail-in and early votes meant the count often dramatically shifted one way or the other. Let's take a look at major events leading to the announcement of results.
First came the tweet claiming a big win and an alleged attempt to steal the election. Then the press conference, where incumbent President Donald Trump claims there is a deliberate attempt by a group of people to overturn his victory.
I want to thank the American people for their tremendous support. Millions and millions of people voted for us tonight. And a very sad group of people is trying to disenfranchise that group of people. And we won't stand for it. I want to thank the First Lady, my entire family, and Vice President Pence, Mrs. Pence, for being with us, all three of us. And we were getting ready for a big celebration. We were winning everything, and all of a sudden it was just called off.
But for his Democratic rival, Joe Biden, it's not over until it is over.
I'm here to tell you tonight, we believe we're on track to win this election. We knew because of the unprecedented early vote and the mail-in vote that it was going to take a while. We're going to have to be patient until the hard work of tallying the votes is finished. And it ain't over till every vote is counted, every ballot is counted. But we're feeling good. We're feeling good about where we are.
To win the election, each candidate needs at least 270 electoral votes. The eventual winner will lead a nation strained by a pandemic that has killed over 231,000 people and left millions more jobless amid racial tensions and political polarization that only worsened during election campaign. As the day progressed and votes are counted in a handful of critical states, hundreds of demonstrators take to the streets, demanding that every vote be counted after the Trump campaign launched a legal bid to stop counting the remaining ballots in Pennsylvania, as well as Wisconsin, Michigan, and Georgia.
The Democrats know that the only way that they can win this election is to cheat in Pennsylvania. And we've seen it from day one. We found ballots in drainage ditches. They're not letting our poll watchers watch the polls. They're not letting them inside. There's video after video of them passing out collateral material in polling sites all over Philadelphia. They're trying to cheat.
So we are going to continue the lawsuit here. We're going to bring a second one, and then we're going to bring a federal lawsuit. And we're going to take a very good look at whether we bring this nationally. We certainly are going to bring it here and in Wisconsin. Quite possibly we'll do a national lawsuit and really expose the corruption of the Democrat Party. But this is beyond anything I've ever seen before.
As Republicans mount legal challenges, the Biden camp is undeterred. While not declaring victory as the remaining votes are counted, Mr. Biden says he's confident he will clinch the presidency, insisting that every vote must be counted.
Now, every vote must be counted. No one's going to take our democracy away from us. Not now, not ever. America's come too far. America's fought too many battles. America's endured too much to ever let that happen. We, the people, will not be silenced. We, the people, will not be bullied. We, the people, will not surrender. My friends, I'm confident we'll emerge victorious. But this will not be my victory alone or our victory alone. It'll be a victory for the American people, for our democracy, for America. And there will be no blue states and red states when we win.
To win an election in the United States, each candidate needs at least 270 electoral votes. Meanwhile, as Americans digest this year's result, pollsters are drawing criticism once again. Just like 2016, some polls were off the mark ahead of the elections, with Donald Trump performing much better than some polls had suggested.
Meanwhile, some Africans running for office in the United States have emerged winners. 2 Nigerians were one of the first to announce their victory.
9 Nigerian Americans were on the ballot for various elective offices in the U.S., and some have emerged winners. Oye Owolewa from Kwara State has won. He was running to represent Washington, D.C. District of Columbia. He won by 135,234 votes against his challenger, Robinson Paul. The other person is Esther Baji, a 35-year-old daughter of a priest and a librarian, both Nigerian immigrants. Esther ran on the platform of the Minnesota Democratic Farmer Labor Party and won the seat for District 59B in the Minnesota House of Representatives with 17,396 votes. When we spoke to her on Tuesday, she already had a plan of action for the constituency.
Running for office was really just kind of a culmination of the types of public service I've done, and also just seeing that we needed to have decision makers at the table that really understood the struggles of working people, particularly working families, students who have recently graduated, dealing with student debt, and particularly in the housing crisis. Here in Minnesota, even before the pandemic started, we had a housing crisis, and our answer to people if they didn't have enough money for a place to live was they had to be out on the street. So that was something that in my volunteer work, I've been advising tenants who are facing eviction, and that's something that I look forward to working on in the State House should I be elected today.
Others that took part include Yomi Fakwarusi, Yinka Faleti, Paul Akijo in California, Adewumi Kuforiji in Delaware, April Ademiluyi, Ngozi Akubuike, and Benjamin Osemenam in their respective states.
More than 160 million Americans voted in the presidential election, producing the highest turnout rate in 120 years. Early voting reached unprecedented heights with more than 100 million people voting prior to the election day. These record-breaking levels meant voters who wait for November the 3rd faced shorter lines as they cast their ballots.
Millions of people went to the polls amid an election campaign fraught with anxiety over the prospect of voter intimidation and the chance of civil unrest after a historically divisive election. But as polls started to close on the east coast of the U.S., reports from across the country reflected a day of peaceful voting with only sporadic reports of incidents of intimidation, misinformation, and technological problems with voting machines. The first votes of the day cast were from a small New Hampshire town. The polls opened shortly after midnight for the U.S. presidential election at the Hale House at Balsam's Hotel in the hamlet of Dixville Notch. With only 5 residents, the polls closed just a few minutes later after all 5 had cast their ballots.
For the 60th year, this is our anniversary year, the voters of Dixville are gathering at midnight to literally cast first-in-the-nation ballots. It's an honor and as I mentioned, it's a privilege that this community has been partaking in for 6 decades now. This year we have 5 voters, 5 registered voters.
Voters in the all-important swing state of Wisconsin turned out from 7 a.m. to cast their ballots. At the same time, the state's election commission also began counting mail-in and absentee ballots as soon as the polls opened. There were, however, some concerns over COVID-19 safety measures.
One of the questions I asked one of the ladies that we were in line with was, does that room look like it's big enough to fit 25 people in it safely under these conditions? Didn't certainly seem like it, but some things are more important than others. It shouldn't be. We shouldn't have to weigh that. We shouldn't have to balance that, but some things are more important than others, which is why I came out of the house today.
In another battleground state, First Lady Melania Trump voted in Palm Beach, Florida. The First Lady, who contracted COVID-19 last month, smiled and waved at reporters and said she was feeling great. Elsewhere in the state, polling stations across Miami-Dade County were largely quiet throughout the day after an initial flurry of early morning voting at some locations. It was majorly a low-key day for in-person voting in Minneapolis, Minnesota, following a record number of absentee ballots. More than 60% of Minneapolis voters also cast their ballots during the early voting period. Like the rest of the country, polling stations in Michigan experienced a smooth voting process. Throughout the day, election workers could be seen swooping in to sanitize voting booths after each use, and bottles of antibacterial gel were prominent through the polling station.
Everybody was very friendly, very pleasant. Lines went smoothly. I was probably in line for maybe 30 minutes. I got here about 7:15 or so. The pollers, everybody was just nice and pleasant. Even the people in the line, everybody was pleasant, talking to each other. So everything was nice. Everything went well.
In true Texas style, voters arrived by horseback at the polling station in Houston.
I just think Black heritage is very important to me, and growing up in this area, we use our horses to go to school, we use our horses to go to the store, and why not use your horse to go vote? So I think it's very important that you exercise your right, and it's also you can exercise your right and be more different, you know, just be original, and I'm all about being original, so I decided to ride my horse to the polls today.
Texas, the second largest U.S. state, is traditionally a Republican stronghold. And there were festive scenes at Dodger Stadium, one of many Los Angeles landmarks to become a voting center. Voters were treated to a musical accompaniment by a mariachi band as they cast their ballots. The band's performance was organized by immigrant rights group the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights.
The election comes after America's worst ever week for new coronavirus cases, with more than 1,000 people dying each day. Even as COVID-19 infections are highest in the United States, people who have the virus were allowed to cast their vote in person in the 2020 presidential election. However, the COVID-19 positive voters were required to take all possible measures to protect workers at polling stations.
What looked like a coronavirus testing site in Missouri was actually a polling location where those who had tested positive for COVID-19 could cast their votes in the presidential election. Workers clad in protective face shields, hospital gowns and gloves took ballots from drivers in a line of vehicles at the curbside polling location.
I've been in this line for 3 hours and come out to vote. I think everybody should do their civic duty. Note to self, don't have a COVID positive result during a presidential election, but they're doing the best they can, so.
For states without drive-ins, the U.S. Centers for Disease Prevention and Control said voters who have tested positive or may have been exposed to the coronavirus should follow the standard advice to wear a mask, stay at least 6 feet away from others, bring their own pens and sanitize their hands before and after voting. The CDC also said that those who were either sick or in quarantine should inform polling station staff upon their arrival to cast their votes. Many had wondered how all these measures will impact the voting process. For some voters in New York, not much.
It feels a little bit weird. I think at this point it does feel, less anxious than I imagined it could have been. Yeah. Just because I feel like everyone's got their groove as far as, washing hands, staying 6 feet apart. Yeah. So it's honestly, I really think the results of the election are kind of outweighing the anxiety of the pandemic.
As millions of Americans voted in Tuesday's presidential election, the number of cases in the country surpassed 9.4 million, rising by 1 million in just 2 weeks. On the same day, the number of coronavirus patients in U.S. hospitals breached 50,000, the highest level in nearly 3 months. The country has recorded over 230,000 deaths, the highest in the world.
When Foreign Dispatches returns in just a moment, Christmas is likely to look very different this year in Europe as governments impose restrictions to curb the spread of COVID-19. Thanks for staying with us. Christmas has come early in London's iconic Oxford Street as the festive lights have been switched on for 2020, despite the coronavirus pandemic overshadowing the countdown to the holiday season.
Christmas lights across the West End of London light up to mark the beginning of the festive season. In Oxford Street, one of the world's famous shopping destination, blue and white sparkle banners scroll with messages of hope designed to celebrate the silent heroes of 2020, those who have donated their time and effort to help others during the pandemic. The public are free to nominate anyone whose name they want to see sparkle. Although the lights give a festive cheer, the coronavirus pandemic and a new national lockdown overshadows the countdown to the holiday season.
Christmas is going to be different this year, perhaps very different, but it's my sincere hope and belief that by taking tough action now, we can allow families across the country to be together. My priority, our priority remains keeping people in education, so childcare, early years settings, schools, colleges and universities will all remain open.
Britain, which has the highest official death toll in Europe from COVID-19, is grappling with more than 20,000 new coronavirus cases a day, and scientists have warned the worst-case scenario of 80,000 dead could be exceeded. With a new national lockdown now in place, many feel it's a price worth paying to save Christmas.
It's probably needed. It's probably not what anybody really wants, and Boris probably didn't want to take that decision anyway. You know, it was bad enough, you know, back in March. So I think at the end of the day, we're just going to have to do it, because otherwise Christmas is just going to be a complete write-off, I think.
In some of the most onerous restrictions in Britain's peacetime history, until December 2nd, people will only be allowed to live home for specific reasons such as education, work, exercise, shopping for essentials and medicines, or caring for the vulnerable. Several cabinet ministers have hinted England's lockdown could extend to next year, with the government considering a brief relaxation over the Christmas period. If the latest restrictions stay in place despite the lights, Christmas will look very different for families in the UK.
Many were eyeing the end-of-year celebrations to forget a difficult year that has put a strain on small businesses and the economy. But for medical experts in France, they say sharing meals with friends and relatives for Christmas seems a long shot.
For the next month, non-essential shops, bars and restaurants are ordered to stay shut. People have to stay at home and carry authorizations with them to venture out in France. After months of lockdown, the promise of normality by Christmas kept many going, but festive restrictions look ever more likely.
I don't think we'll be able to have family Christmas dinners. It seems very unlikely to me. We'll continue to see an increase in the number of people being hospitalized and being admitted in intensive care units because those people are already infected. So the lockdown will not have any impact on what's going to happen in the 2 or 3 weeks to come in hospital wards. And this is where we expect the worst, because we are worried that the health system will become completely saturated.
The measures to curb the country's COVID-19 infection numbers will last until at least December 1st, with anyone leaving their home requiring to carry a special document or otherwise face fines.
It's really tough because I live on my own. So I'm condemned to see no one for weeks, and I can't even see my family as they live far away. It's very sad for everyone, but if this is what it takes to relieve the hospitals, I'm fine with it. But it's very tough.
Small businesses are also bearing the brunt. The Vignette's bookshop, situated in the 10th arrondissement of Paris, was supposed to open on Monday, November 2nd, but the lockdown changed the plans of co-owner Ariane Roland. Instead of welcoming readers in the shop, A table bars the entrance. Clients can now order books and collect them from the store.
It's sad to have to restrict access to culture like this, to have no books in supermarkets. It's a real defeat for culture, for reading, for everyone's access to reading at this time.
France reported a record 52,518 new COVID-19 cases on Monday, November 2nd, and the number of hospitalized cases rose by more than 1,000 for the fourth time in 8 days, as the pandemic shows no signs of abating despite the new lockdown.
While a lot of other countries have left room for hope, in Germany, officials say the light at the end of the tunnel is a long way off, and Germans will definitely face some form of restrictions this Christmas. However, they say the level of restriction depends on people's adherence to measures already in place under a month-long lockdown.
German Chancellor Angela Merkel says the lockdown, which includes the closure of restaurants, gyms and theaters, is necessary to protect Germany's health system, warning that the number of people with the virus in intensive care units has doubled in the last 10 days. But striking a more hopeful tone than when she presented the lockdown measures last Wednesday, the Chancellor also said that if Germans reduce their contact with each other in November, they would be able to do more over Christmas.
This decision will depend on what happens in November. If we're all reasonable, then we can regain more freedom in December. I don't think there will be big New Year's parties, but that core family members will be able to visit each other, perhaps with protective measures. There are proposals, for example, of a few days of pre-quarantine. For example, when visiting the grandparents, we'll have to see. It will be a Christmas under coronavirus conditions, but will not be a Christmas of loneliness.
Europe's largest economy was widely praised for keeping infection and death rates below those of many of its neighbors in the first phase of the crisis, but is now in the midst of a second wave, like much of the rest of Europe. In its capital, pedestrians have become scarce, and growing numbers of people have opted to wear face masks in public. Some banks and supermarkets have seen long queues at the door due to restrictions on passenger flow, with customers consciously maintaining social distance.
To other developments now, officials in Europe are stepping up security measures after both France and Austria suffered deadly terror attacks in the last week. The attack in Vienna happened just a few hours to go before a coronavirus curfew was due to go into effect. Last week's attack on a church in Nice also unfolded on the eve of a national lockdown in France.
Monday night in Vienna was supposed to be a last chance at freedom before a nationwide coronavirus curfew largely shut down the city for a month. But at about 8 p.m, without warning, the shooting started. 4 people were fatally shot and 23 others wounded in the attack. Police killed one gunman wearing an explosive belt that turned out to be fake. Authorities identified him as a 20-year-old convicted jihadist and said they could not rule out the possibility that other shooters were still on the loose.
This was clearly an Islamist terrorist attack. It was an attack out of hatred for our fundamental values, out of hatred for our way of life, and out of hatred for our democracy, where all people are equal in rights and dignity. Last night will therefore go down in history as a night in which some of our fellow human beings fell victim to a brutal attack, an attack which in reality was aimed at all of us, an attack on our free society. But one thing is clear, we will not be intimidated by the terrorists.
Until Monday, Austria had been spared the kind of major attacks that have hit other European countries. The attack followed shortly after 2 deadly assaults by lone Islamist attackers in France, where some Muslims have been angered by the publications of satirical caricatures of Islam's prophet Muhammad. The resurgence of jihadist-inspired terror attacks in Europe after a lull, first in France, now in Austria, is prompting rising alarm among European security officials that they are once again facing a coordinated terrorism wave, possibly managed by overseas plotters or at least heavily inspired by them.
And that's Foreign Dispatches this week. Thank you so much for watching. As always, remember that you can catch up with all our top stories on channelstv.com. I'm Teniola Shoboale. I'll see you next time.